Hello, everybody. Welcome to the second installment of our Delbarton YouTube history of Delbarton School with some personal memoirs from myself, Father Giles Hayes. You may remember I mentioned in the first memoir that I came here in 1951 to be tested, came as a student in 1952, remained here through 56, went to college for a couple of years, then came back to the Abbey as a young monk, and have been here ever since. After and right now, this is 2015. I've been teaching for well more than 50 years at the school consecutively, and I'm very happy to have the opportunity to say a few things that might be meaningful to those who want to know a little bit more about the history of Delbarton, but also might want to uh, learn a little bit more about what some alums have experienced. Again, as we did in the first issue of our YouTube presentation, about what we now call Old Main. The Old Main is a building built between 1880 and 1883 by the owner, Luther Kuntz, and it was lived in partially. It was like a summer home, so to speak, and for his family and his children. Uh, the family's main home was in New York City, where Mr. Kuntz was a banker and an entrepreneur in a variety of ways, along with his children later on. Uh, the we have two sources of information about this building. One source is the printed written source, uh, magazine articles and so on, and I'll refer to a few of them in a minute. That's solid history. The other source would be memoirs that I took from the oldest monks uh, at the Abbey who came to Delbarton in 1926, 1927. Now, these gentlemen, when I took these memoirs in the late 1950s, were at that time 70 or 80 years old. So some of what I'm saying is going to be from those memoirs, and I will make a distinction as we go through, because some is oral tradition and the other is solid historical fact. Of Old Main, and about the building of the pergola and the intention that Kuntz had to build a French garden on the east side of Old Main comes from the daily papers and bills of sale and so on. The what we have learned from that solid history is that Kuntz brought uh, the materials to build the pergola behind me. That would be the capitals, Corinthian capitals, and much of the other material in the pergola, uh, and the material uh, reinforcing the roof over the porch of this west side of Old Main in 1901, 1902. The building itself had been completed by then. It turns out that uh, the initial pillars here on the west side of the porch were wooden until he was able to get the granite pillars from the estate of Mr. Stewart uh, on Fifth Avenue in New York, an estate, a building that was raised in 2000, in 1901, 1902, etc. The statues came, according to the information we have, from the um, from Europe and perhaps also from domestic sources, but we do have evidence that the statues were brought in, some of them disturbed and harmed a little bit from Italy, probably sometime between 1901 and 1908 or 09. So it was some years before this estate was completed. We don't have solid information on the landscape architecture of of this garden. That is, we don't have available to us written documents about the landscape architect. However, from the monks who I interviewed back in the 1950s, they insisted to a person that the landscape architect who chose the trees and who, perhaps even with Kuntz, went over to Europe to get certain seeds to plant the trees, was Frederick Law Olmsted, who was the great 19th century landscape architect who built the Central Park in New York City. Now, if you have an opportunity to come here, take a good look at the trees. Uh, we do know that the oldest trees are actually outside the garden. They are called cucumber magnolias, and they are just west of the western wall of the garden. There are two of them there. Maybe Frederick Law Olmsted chose those, but the choice was consistent with his intention, or the intention of perhaps one of his associates, to put the trees that you see to my left and to my right exactly where they are. Because he anticipated, the architect, that these trees eventually would grow as big as they are now, and they would shade Old Main in the summer, and after all the leaves fell, they would allow Old Main to be made warm during the winter. In addition, back in the 1950s, when I was here as a student, there were two large maples in the front of Old Main. Very, very large trees. Very large trees. And they offered shade, again, to this building. I remember distinctly being very, very comfortable walking into this building in the pre-air conditioned days. And that, of course, was determined by the trees and their growth and their prevention of the sun getting in, or their allowance of the sun coming in during the winter. Unfortunately, those two maples in front of Old Main both came down during succeeding hurricanes in the mid 1950s. As you look around this garden, you will see how the monks, from the time we came here until the present, working with our maintenance folks, have preserved the beauty of the place. And the intention, of course, is to show the beauty of the earth, the beauty of the environment to all who come here. This is a major, major theme of St. Benedict. And it's enrooted in the concept of vows that the Benedictines take of stability, which means somehow the divine life is even in the earth itself. And St. Benedict wrote a chapter on the goods of the monastery, the tools of the monastery. And he said the tools of the monastery, the hose, the picks, the shovels, have to be treated with the same dignity as the vessels of the altar. Just think about that. And so monks of old have always maintained their properties in very, very beautiful ways. And it's part of the spirituality of the monk. It's part of who we are.